Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So as you see, Canto 11, Chapter 11, that's Uddhava Gita. We're with Uddhava and Krishna in Dwarka. The Uddhava Gita began with Chapter 7. The question that is being responded to from Chapter 7 through Chapter 10 is how to overcome undue attachment to the temporary, so that I can see and understand you without the obstruction of Maya, because Maya is exactly that, undue attachment to the temporary, thus forgetting and covering ourselves and our relationship with Krishna. And a lot has been covered in those 5 chapters, 7, 8, 9, 10, 4, and then now 11. At the end of chapter 10, knowledge and detachment is the theme. Knowledge of the temporary and detachment from the temporary because it's temporary, thus freeing consciousness to become attached to the Supreme, to Krishna. Unobstructed bhakti, knowledge and detachment. And Krishna then went on to, after giving a detailed explanation, expanded it further, explaining that this applies even to the portion of the Vedas that deals with striving for heavenly destination, because that's also temporary, subject to the same impermanence of this world. So the discussion is now moving towards becoming freed from or liberated from undue attachment to the temporary. Then Uddhava asks a very pointed, blunt question. It is said in scriptures, living entity, Nitya Baddha living entity, can become a Nitya Siddha living entity. That sounds like a contradiction. Could you explain? And Krishna says, yeah, the question itself is misleading. You don't become either conditioned or liberated. That is, the Maya Shakti, he elaborates, his Maya Shakti has 2 divisions, Vidya and Avidya, but the soul itself is neither Vidya or Avidya. The soul itself is pure, like I am. So I don't become covered, living entity doesn't. Although one can use that language in terms of becoming covered, becoming uncovered, but the soul itself is not covered. The soul itself is eternally pure. That's Krishna's explanation. So then, following that initial response, he's going further and further and further. And this section is 10 verses, where what's the distinction between the liberated and conditioned state? Remembering that the Avidya and Vidya Shaktis are designations. It's not the living entity, but it's coverings of the living entity. So the living entity is covered by the Lord's Maya Shakti, Vidya Shakti, or Maya Shakti's subpotency of Vidya Shakti. One can describe what that's like, remembering that it's a designation. And in the just a little more subtle point, it's an important point. When bhakti, this is when bhakti is absent. When bhakti is present, there is also a sub-potency of bhakti, that's of the internal potency, not Maya Shakti, but Antaranga Shakti, internal potency, that's knowledge, that's a subset of bhakti. And when that bhakti is in contact with living entity, or vice versa, living entity is in contact with bhakti, then that liberating aspect and knowledge potency is part or a subset of that soul's experience. So now, there's a distinction being made by Krishna. Maya Shakti is external potency, is internal spiritual potency, and the external potency is a reflection of the internal potency. As the internal potency has a chit capacity or cognizance capacity, the Maya Shakti has its reflection that also limits the living entity's potential experience. That is to say, Vidya Shakti that comes from the illusory energy, knowledge that comes from Maya. There is knowledge that comes from Maya. And that knowledge that comes from Maya can't awaken love of God. It will not. Those who study the Vedas till the cows come home, they cannot achieve love of God. They can achieve knowledge by study of knowledge, portion of the Vedas or aspect of the Vedas, but they can't achieve love of God. Then he started giving this liberated, conditioned compare, contrast with the classic example of the two birds in a tree. And it's not only in the Bhagavatam, it's in 3 different Upanishads, and he goes over it again and again. I mean, the commentators go over it again and again. And so now we're continuing with this section of Krishna describing, like he is eternally liberated, living entity has a likeness like him in his purified state and is also liberated. And here's the distinction. Well, I'm going to go back. Some nice graphics. Text 10. Sure. The same teaching as Bhagavad Gita, right? Right? Bhagavad Gita teaches. Do you know the Bhagavad Gita verse? Where material nature carries out actions. You're not familiar. Material nature carries out actions. The kartritvam, the karmani, lokasya surjate prabhu. Krishna says, never consider yourself the cause of action, karta, aham. Never consider yourself the cause of action. 2, never consider yourself the cause of the result of action. 3, never consider yourself as inducing others to act, for all this is carried out by the modes of material nature. The machine carries the soul. The soul that's being carried by the machine, the body that's moved by the 3 modes of nature, the soul that's being carried by the machine may think, now I'm doing this and that. And now I'm creating this result, that result. Now I'm inducing others to act. We think like that all the time. All the time, all the time, all the time. And that teaching of Bhagavad Gita, that's false ego. So Krishna is saying the same thing here to Uddhava, but it's like, it's a graduate study of the same thing. It's not a new thing. It's the same thing. Bhaktisiddhanta's translation of this same verse, text 10. Under the control of his previous deeds, a foolish person accepts a material body and proudly considers himself the doer of all activities. Thus, he becomes entangled in all kinds of bodily affairs as the reactions to his fruitive activities that are actually carried out by the three material qualities. And the BBT purport, which is short, as stated in Bhagavad Gita 3:27, Prakrite kriyamanani gunai karmani sarvashaha ahankara vimudhatma kartaham iti manyate. The living entity is dependent on the Supreme Entity, Lord Krishna, but because of false pride, he ignores the Supreme Personality of Godhead and considers himself to be the performer of action and enjoyer of everything. Srila Madhvacharya states that just as a king punishes a rebellious subject, the Supreme Lord punishes the sinful living entity by forcing him to transmigrate from one body to another in the network of the illusory energy. And here is the purport by Bhaktisiddhanta, which is real short. Those who are bewildered by false ego foolishly claim to be the doers of all activities, which are actually carried out by the three modes of material nature, accepting the material body as the self. They think that they are working independently, although their activities are fully under the control of material nature. Now, the conclusion part of this verse, Bhaktisiddhanta has made a summary of Vishwanath's commentary, and then there's Vishwanath's commentary. This material body is received as the result of one's previous activities. While residing in this body, one manipulates his senses and engages them in various activities. In this way, he becomes entangled in the actions and reactions of work. How does it happen? Paragraph. Because he is bewildered by false ego, the conditioned soul thinks himself to be the doer. Same verse from 3:27 Bhagavad Gita, Prakrite kriyamanani. The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of material nature. And Vishwanath's commentary is almost the same. The fool, situated in his body which is dependent on previous karmas, is bound by actions produced by the senses, guna bhavyena. Why? By ahankara, he thinks, I'm the doer. And it is said, same Bhagavad Gita 3:27. Look at that. We're moving on to text 11. Let's take a look at what it shows for text 10. This is a graphic for text 10. The living entity is dependent on the Supreme Entity, Lord Krishna. But because of false pride, he ignores the Supreme Personality of Godhead and considers himself to be the performer of action and enjoyer of everything. Srila Madhvacharya states that just as a king punishes a rebellious subject, the Supreme Lord punishes the sinful living entity by forcing him to transmigrate from one body to another in the network of the illusory energy. Now remember the step back, and the topic is, what's the distinction between a liberated and conditioned state? Remembering that both the liberated and conditioned state are not a full description of the living entity, but a description of the vidya and avidya potency of Maya. So those that are under the influence of the avidya potency do the transmigration thing. And in that transmigration thing, they think a certain way through agency of false ego. I'm the doer, I'm the creator of the results, I'm the enjoyer of the results, and life goes on, birth after birth. Now we're moving on to text 11. That was the conditioned. Now here's the enlightened person, fixed in detachment. Now remember, there's been 4 chapters of knowledge and detachment. 4 chapters. 4 chapters and lots of detail. Knowledge and detachment. An enlightened person, fixed in detachment, engages in body. And lying down, sitting, walking, bathing, seeing, touching, smelling, eating, hearing, and so on, but is never entangled by such activities. Indeed, remaining as a witness of all bodily functions, he merely engages his bodily senses with their objects and does not become entangled, like an unintelligent person. In case you ever wondered what it's like to be enlightened, here's a picture. Bhaktisiddhanta's translation. Learned persons who are fixed in detachment engage their senses in activities such as, same list, but they never become entangled. By simply remaining as a witness, they do not become entangled like foolish people. And the BBT purport. In the previous chapter, chapter 10, Uddhava asked Lord Krishna why an enlightened person, just like a conditioned soul, engages in external bodily functions. Here is the Lord's answer. While engaged in bodily functions, an unintelligent person is attached to both the means and the end of material life, and therefore experiences intense lamentation and jubilation on the material platform. A self-realized soul, however, studies the inevitable defeat and suffering of ordinary persons and does not make the mistake of trying to enjoy the bodily functions, even slightly. He instead remains a detached witness, merely engaging his senses in the normal functions of bodily maintenance, as indicated here by the word adyam. He engages something other than his actual self in material experience. Interesting. Bhaktisiddhanta's very short purport. An intelligent and experienced person is never compelled to act under the influence of the 3 modes of material nature. He remains detached from activities like, there's the same list, and is not forced to perform activities like looking, touching, smelling, and eating. Perception doesn't stop. Activities don't stop. But the experience of those activities changes. From an observer, like the 2 birds in the tree, like the observer. And although the body is engaging, he's not identifying with himself with the body engaging, including eating and other things that seem to be, enjoyable. Doing enjoyable things, or whatever things, but not in the consciousness of being the doer, but in the consciousness of being the observer and watching Prakriti do its thing. Now that's only possible, it's only possible when the person is in the quality of goodness. So obviously the things that are being done are in the quality of goodness because that's the mode of the person. Still, in that when that knowledge is operating, this is their experience, distinct from the one that's moved by false ego and covered by the avidya potency. Okay, here is Bhaktisiddhanta's gloss of Vishwanath's commentary. A foolish person, as a result of his attachment for material objects, enjoys sense gratification, but then becomes entangled in material bondage. However, according to the logic of vadita anuvritti, a liberated person is never entangled, even if he seems somewhat connected with material happiness and lamentation. A nice example of that is Jad Bharat, when he's insulted by the king twice. He apparently shows the affectation of being disturbed, and then very quickly, knowledge potency settles him. He has very strong ballast in that ship, crossing the ocean of material existence, and he becomes quite balanced. So he speaks strongly. First of all, he speaks, but he speaks, chastisingly. Now, it's with all reason and logic. He's not like some people that insult other people. But, it's not reasonable, my dear king, that you're speaking like this. So he's scolding him and chastising him with a little edge, a little unhappiness. Apparently like the material happiness and lamentation of worldly people. One who is actually detached from matter, even though he may accept material objects for the maintenance of his body, remains aloof as the witness of his activities. And here's Vishwanath's actual commentary. Uddhava asked, quote, how does he enjoy and how does he sleep and eat? From Canto 11, Chapter 10, verse 36, previous chapter. This is answered in 3 verses. The bound jiva is bound by joy and sorrow arising from his actions and for attaining sleep, sitting, and eating out of attachment. But the liberated person is not bound while doing these activities, even though he may experience a little joy or sorrow, as in bhaditanuvriti. Bhaditanuvriti. This is because he is detached. Though he engages his senses and sense objects, he remains as the witness and does not personally involve himself. Okay, so now some nice graphics by Shruti Mangara. While engaged in bodily functions, interesting graphic, huh? While engaged in bodily functions, an unintelligent person is attached to both the means and the end of material life, and therefore experiences intense lamentation and jubilation on the material platform. A self-realized soul, however, studies the incredible defeat and suffering of ordinary persons and does not make the mistake of trying to enjoy the bodily functions, even slightly. He instead remains a detached witness, merely engaging his senses in the normal functions of bodily maintenance. Now, what's that image on the right side? What does it look like to you? On the left side, it's very clear. It's a field with flowers and a hill and green grass and so on. Barren field on the right side, looks like. Yeah, but it's not colorful, that's for sure. But anyway, yeah, comedy and sadness. Yeah, the masks. I'll ask her what she was thinking when she made this one. Looks like a field that's just kind of barren. An agricultural field or something like that. Okay, so now we're moving on to texts 11 and 12. They're combined. Interesting one. Although the sky, or space, is the resting place of everything, the sky does not mix with anything, nor is it entangled. Similarly, the sun is not attached to the water in which it is reflected within innumerable reservoirs, and the mighty wind blowing everywhere is not affected by the innumerable aromas and atmospheres through which it passes. In the same way, a self-realized soul is completely detached from the material body and the material world around it. He is like a person who has awakened and arisen from a dream. With expert vision, sharpened by detachment, the self-realized soul cuts all doubts to pieces through knowledge of the self and completely withdraws his consciousness from the expansion of material variety. And Bhaktisiddhanta's translation, similar. Although everything rests in space, it does not mix with anything. That space doesn't. The sun is not affected by the water in which its reflection appears, and the wind that blows everywhere is not affected by the aromas it carries. Similarly, the self-realized soul is detached from the material body and the world he lives in. He is like someone who has awakened from a dream. With the sword of knowledge sharpened by detachment, the self-realized soul cuts to pieces all doubts born of misidentification with matter, and thus withdraws his mind from the temporary displays of Maya. It's a good chapter to remember, huh? BBT purport. According to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, a self-realized soul cuts all doubts to pieces by direct experience of his true spiritual identity. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is Lord Krishna, and there is no possibility of any existence separate from Lord Krishna. Such expert knowledge cuts all doubts to pieces, as stated here. Prakriti stopi asamsaktaha. Like the sky, the sun, and the wind, one who is self-realized is not entangled. Though situated within the material creation of the Lord, nanatva, or material variety, refers to one's material body, the body of others, and the unlimited paraphernalia for bodily sense gratification, both physical and mental. By awakening to Krishna consciousness, one completely retires from illusory sense gratification and becomes absorbed in the progressive realization of the soul situated within the body. As revealed in the example of the two birds in a tree, both the individual soul and the personality of Godhead are completely separate from the gross and subtle material bodies. If one turns one's face to the Lord, recognizing one's eternal dependence on Him, there will be no further suffering or anxiety, even though one is situated within the material world. The unlimited experiences of material objects only increase one's anxiety, whereas perception of the absolute truth, Sri Krishna, immediately brings one to the platform of peace. Thus, one who is intelligent retires from the world of matter and becomes fully self-realized Krishna-conscious person. And Bhaktisiddhanta's purport is shorter. A self-realized soul is freed from all doubts when he directly experiences his eternal spiritual identity. Lord Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and nothing is separate from him. Such an understanding frees one from all doubts, as stated here, just as the sky, the sun, or the wind. One who is self-realized is not entangled, although situated within the material creation of the Lord. And then two little short ones, and we're done for this morning. Here's Bhaktisiddhanta's gloss of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. How is such detachment possible? The answer is provided here by giving the example of space, the air, and the sun. One who has cut off the attachment to the sense of his senses for their objects, by utilizing the sharp weapon of renunciation, one can remain aloof from the material body and the material world. And then here's actually Vishwanath's commentary. One who is not affected. Why is he not affected? Just as ether is situated everywhere but is not attached to anything, just as the sun distributes its rays everywhere but is not affected, just as air spreads everywhere without being affected, after having destroyed all doubts, such as his fitness for liberation by sharp detachment, asangena, sharp detachment, asangena. He renounces varieties of bodies, nana tvat, in this world. Okay. Nice graphic here. This one's easy. Although the sky or space is the resting place of everything, the sky does not mix with anything, nor is it entangled. Similarly, the sun is not at all attached to the water in which it is reflected within insurmountable reservoirs, and the mighty wind blowing everywhere is not affected by the innumerable aromas and atmospheres through which it passes. And then the conclusion. In the same way, a self-realized soul is completely detached from the material body and the material world around it. He is like a person who has awakened and arisen from a dream. With expert vision, sharpened by detachment, the self-realized soul cuts all doubts to pieces through knowledge of the self and completely withdraws his consciousness from the expansion of material variety. Now remember, from earlier in this chapter, when Krishna was explaining the avidya and vidya potencies as being part of Maya Shakti, Krishna added, and commentators expand, that there's a third potency that is a Maya Shakti potency, and that's the Sanskrit phrase that's used is pradhan, and the explanation is pradhan produces gross and subtle bodies. But for that matter, pradhan produces the whole cosmic manifestation. It's not exactly produces, it's the instrument for producing, it's the ingredients that make up the material creation, but it's part of Maya Shakti. So when there's knowledge of the self by detachment, that not only the body and the mind, but also the pradhan portion, the other parts of the pradhan portion, the objects and the creation in which we are, situated is also a Maya Shakti potency, and we're not Maya Shakti. So one can deal with it, move around within it, but not identify with it and become attached to it and the pains and the pleasures of it. One can perceive. Just before coming here, I was in Boston. And I don't know if you got the effect of that hurricane down here, lots of rain. No? A little bit? It was raining every day, like, sewers were flooding, and it was day after day after day. Some places it was flooding. In the U.S. just from that hurricane. Anyway, here it's nice and sunny. Pretty hot too. That's okay. But that's just that is part of the pradhan portion of Maya Shakti. And one who identifies with the self doesn't identify with the temporary. It's circling back to the question that was asked in chapter 6. How do I overcome undue affinity for the temporary? So, all this knowledge and detachment teaching, elaborate, like, all right, I get it. And yet we still remain attached because we're attached or prone to be attached. Now, Uddhava is asking that question not because he's attached, he's a pure devotee, but he's asking as if he's not. He's being induced by Krishna, like Arjuna is being induced by Krishna, to ask as if he's not, to provide teachings. You can say this is Sambandha Gyan, but then when you get the Sambandha Gyan down, and it actually is within, how do you experience life? That's the section that's being covered. What does it look like? What does it feel like? It's not at the stage of unalloyed bhakti yet. That's coming, attractions. But it's a preliminary to unalloyed bhakti. It's important for us. As it's in Bhagavad Gita, here it is in Uddhava Gita, and boy, is it elaborate. Now, I was, as reading this morning, I was thinking, how is one, the tendency to be attached to the temporary is so strong. How does one who doesn't have elaborate teaching like this get it? Supposing there's, a very pious person, very prone to carefully study their scriptures and follow their scriptures and pray to God and all those good things. How to overcome this tendency and being involved with and identifying with the material energy, along with it the happiness and distress. Well, attachment to the Supreme brings bhakti, brings knowledge of detachment causelessly. But how clear is the understanding of the soul, and how clear is the understanding of God? I was just listening this morning, Prabhupada saying, say, yes, you're a religious person, but ask that religious person, please tell me about God. And there's silence. So if there's love of God, if that's the goal, I'm just elaborating here, but if there's love of God, then it's a person. And if there's the clarity about the person is not in good focus, then there has to be the affinity for the temporary. Now, it's not to say that there are not transcendentally realized elevated souls in different, religious traditions of all kinds. There are, and they're very special. But the Vedic, minimally, the Vedic tradition, the Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam particularly, here are giving us really strong medicine to prepare us for unmixed devotion. Now, it's not that we're meant to become avadutas, like the Avaduta Brahman Dattatreya from the previous section. Uddhava is not an avaduta. Uddhava's an administrator, and a very wise one at that. And so forth. Vedic kings, ideal kings, were also very involved in the world, but not attached. They would do things that looked like what other kings that are attached would do. For example, Maharaj Yudhisthira, together with his 4 brothers, ruled the world. And when it came time for the Rajasuya Yagya, they went in all directions with the challenge horse, inviting persons to either pay tribute or engage in battle and be defeated. They all paid tribute. No one did battle. So he was ruling the world. And then Maharaj Parikshit became the king, and he went to those same places. Now, he was already ruling in those places, but he had to establish himself. And Prabhupada explains this. I found it very interesting. It's not like Napoleon or Hitler going around conquering places, trying to control. Rather, the purpose of Maharaj Parikshit was to establish governance of God-conscious leaders. And governance of God-conscious leaders would accept Maharaj Parikshit because of his quality. But if there were other persons, then he was dealing with those other persons who were not God-conscious persons. It's not that there were battles with other persons of other religions because you're of another religion, so we'll do battle with you. Not like that. But to establish, it was very clear, whatever the religious practice, follow it. And the Brahmana says follow it, and the Kshatriya says follow it, or else. So that's part of the qualified king, and that's why kings would do what they did, but it was not with the same intent and purpose and experience as the worldly person might do. But all of this it's not just an appeal to become an avaduta. It's an appeal to become Krishna conscious in all the things that one does. And to become Krishna conscious, there's this knowledge and detachment, and then doing all things in that condition. Like, it's a very advanced condition. How many persons, amongst all persons, are even striving to know who they are? According to Bhagavad Gita. You know the verse? Manushanam sahasreshu kaschid yatati siddhaye yatatam api siddhanam kaschid vetimam tattva. You know the verse. You're mouthing it as I'm saying it. So out of many millions, some large number of people, hardly one is trying to understand who they are, endeavoring for self-realization. And of those who have understood the soul, that's what's being described here, hardly one knows me in truth. So it's a very elevated state that's being described, and in one sense an essential, at least directional step, because if you're not taking that directional step through knowledge and detachment, then you're going to be befuddled by the temporary and the ups and the downs and the pleasures and the pains, and it's just not going for a ride in the ocean of material existence, being moved by the modes of material nature and so forth. Interesting section. Let's see if there's some discussion. and we'll continue tomorrow. Text 1415. If you want to say something, you got the microphone. Hare Krishna. It's on.
Maharaj, so the previous verse said that to remain detached, but to continue doing what's necessary to keep the body.
Yeah.
Maintenance of the body.
Yeah.
I understand that we try to cultivate sattva gun, but how much should one trust one's instincts? I mean, some people might walk away from a situation of conflict. Some people like to engage aggressively in a situation of things like that based on their instincts. How much should we trust our instincts?
Well, one barometer, it may be the most important barometer, is what's the inspiration for engaging or not engaging? Is it on the ego platform, or is it pleasing Krishna platform? And if it's on the pleasing Krishna platform, then it's not. Then it's super soul, not exactly instinct. Krishna will give direction. Instinct, my understanding of how instinct works is there's impulses born of the modes of material nature. And that's what we call instinct. The fight or flight, for example. You don't have to think about it. It's built into the body. But so somebody that's on a Krishna conscious platform, there may be some urging or instinct towards something, but they don't follow it. Or they check in with the Krishna channel to see what's the inspiration that Krishna is giving in this situation, and it's just staying with is Krishna being pleased? Paramarupa asked a very similar question, not the same, but very similar. In terms of, his question was in relation to doing the everyday worldly things. And when we're doing the everyday worldly things, you have to pay attention. You can't be inattentive. So when you're being attentive to the everyday worldly things, then remembrance of Krishna, and this is for the pleasure of Krishna, kind of fades. And you finish that something, because you're attending to it, is a little complicated or challenging. And then, whoops, I just passed a bunch of time in forgetfulness of Krishna. So now I have to hit the reset button. And so intuition or instinct is going to go on anyways, because the modes of nature are going to go on anyways. And your question is how to trust it. I would say be really cautious. Be ready to step back from each impulse or intuition thought, and learn to ask yourself the question: where is this coming from? Another devotee was sharing a little while ago, very nice. When I'm reading, what I'm really looking for is, how is this going to connect me more with Krishna? And if I'm not thinking, how is it going to connect me more with Krishna, then the benefit I'm going to receive from reading is going to be less. And the application is going to be less. The heart transformation is going to be less, because the real thing is heart transformation. So, similar with this question, we're going to, the modes of nature are acting regardless, because we have a body and a mind. The modes of nature are acting regardless. So be cautious, and take a step back, or two or three, and consider what you've understood from Scripture and what pleasing Krishna means. I mean, in the long run, it's a continuous course correction procedure, heart orientation procedure. Get out your compass and am I heading in the right direction kind of procedure. But then it becomes a continuous process, an ongoing refining and readjusting and realigning process. So as long as that intuition has that element, or inspiration, or impulse, has gut feeling, has that dimension built in, then you act, and then to some degree you're going to refine. Based upon the result. It's often spoken about that Prabhupada would do something like that. He had strategies that, of course, we would say Krishna inspired, and then observing the result, he would recalibrate that policy or decision and adjust accordingly based upon the result. So it's a relationship with Krishna. And what the result we want is not just like numbers or quantity. We want hearts to move in Krishna's direction. We want our heart to move in Krishna's direction. So that's something that you want to check. Anything else? Yes.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. My question is like, in the sadhana stage,
Sadhana stage.
I'm not fully self-realized. So when I try to detach from things like material things, it becomes like hard-hearted and become like impersonalist. So how to balance like being detached but not going to the impersonalist stage?
The answer I just gave is similar, I would say. It can be applied. Rupa Goswami gives us a definition of false renunciation and true renunciation. And you apply that standard, and then the false renunciation is on the material platform. And the true renunciation is utilizing things in Krishna's service. So the operative principle, the detachment principle, is not leaving things, but how you regard things. So the answer, my response to your question is, you continually, at my advice, continually reflect on the bhakti principle, that is, doing or the not doing, like his question, the doing or not doing for the purpose of pleasing Krishna. Anukulyena Krishna Anushilanam, for the purpose of pleasing Krishna. And then it's not impersonal, it's not artificial. It's protection, but protection by the bhakti principle. Let me accept this much because that's the bhakti principle that will assist me in my mood of devotion to Krishna. And and I'm less than perfect, and I'm a sadhaka, so I'm going to mess up. That's okay. Let me accepting that. That is okay, but accepting that that's going to be the case. Let me just focus on for the pleasure of Krishna, and then do or not do on that basis, or involve myself with the material stuff and in situations and relationships and so forth, with that the protective potency of bhakti. Now it's easier said than done, but that's certainly as an antidote for the impersonal, artificial giving up something. There are some things we recommend that we give up very clearly. So when giving them up, let it be as far as the purpose behind giving them up. Let it be a bhakti principle. And sometimes the bhakti principle acts really swiftly, and then things that are unwholesome, or ways of engaging with things and people that's unwholesome, can be very quickly given up. And my thought is going to, in the question answer session, one of the programs recently, there was a devotee who's been a devotee for many years, but he described when he was growing up and going to college, he had become a meat eater, and his brother was advising him, and his family was advising him, give up meat. It's polluting your body, and it's bad, etc., etc. And he couldn't. And then something happened. He met a devotee, gave him a book, and he just, then his brother said, "Great, read the book and try chanting." And his brother wasn't like a Hare Krishna devotee, but just he was kind to his brother. So he said, I was still eating meat, and I just started chanting for 5 days, and then one day the light went on and said, "You know what? I'm going to give up eating meat," and no turning back. So it can happen quickly, but the bhakti principle, awakening, strengthening of the bhakti principle, will guide you away from the unwholesome, artificial giving up, impersonal tendencies. So turn it to similar response to the prior question. Look to the bhakti principle, and you're gonna, not get it right every time. That's okay. You still focus on the areas of life that are easier for you. Give a lot of attention to the bhakti principle. In the areas of life that are more uncertain for you, draw that strength from that other practice, and you'll learn. Krishna will see you're attempting, and Krishna will help you. You have some thoughts you want to share with us? You stayed awake. It was pretty good. A little help from your friends, but okay. Here, take the microphone, please. Anything online? Nothing. Something for yourself?
I mean, nothing major. But I guess I've been thinking about this point of just, it's not easy to maintain that deeper focus going through the different moments of life. The desire is there, everything is there, but sometimes it's just the intensity, the pace of life for me, especially, then, it's hard to maintain the focus. Just a comment, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but really, that's where my thoughts have been of, trying to sit.
I recognize this message that you're sharing. I
Yeah.
want to slow down.
Yeah.
And life doesn't necessarily slow down, but if you can like meter or monitor the amount of what you take in and try to be responsive to, do a qualitative dealing with the movements of life. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
This is from Akshay Hudlikar. Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj. How do we know what pleases Krishna?
How do we know what pleases Krishna?
The conditioning is so strong that at times we take one path and then our mind convinces us to do this first and then later Krishna will be pleased.
Well, those are two different questions. One question is, how do we know what's pleasing to Krishna? And, Guru Sadhu Shastra tells you what's pleasing to Krishna. And then the other is, my mind tricks me sometimes, even when I know what's pleasing to Krishna. I'll just please Krishna later. And I'll follow my mind because it's pretty noisy. It's demanding that I follow the mind. So that's, that's not a foreign experience, a unique experience to you. What to do about it is another question. Then what's pleasing to Krishna? The question, this is an authenticity question that we discussed at length during the Memorial Day weekend. Like, I got to be true to myself. There was some discussion with some people about their eating habits, and I got to be true to myself. I am at this place, and so forth and so on. Accepting and then progress, and being authentic has different standards of being authentic. There's authentic to who we really are. So if attending to something that you know is pleasing to Krishna later is a tendency that you have, then try to leverage it more in the direction of put in the priority position those things that you know are pleasing to Krishna, and do those first. And then you may find that there's 10 other things that are pleasing to Krishna that will displace the thing that you did before you did the thing pleasing to Krishna. You exercise your bhakti muscle. Being a physical therapist, you know all about exercising muscles. When some of them aren't working well. So you exercise, and you build the strength that will help you do that which is pleasing to Krishna first. And then you'll probably find that those things that were not in the priority position may just drop off. But you have to be authentic, so you can't just jump artificially, but you operate in that, you exercise the bhakti muscle regularly, and it becomes strong, and then that becomes the way that you live your life. But you have to exercise that bhakti muscle. That's it. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Haribol.